Um, Welcome to all of you who have joined us. We're going to start in just a few minutes, and it's so exciting to see all of you. I see a lot of my friends out there, and all of the good people that are joining us from tribal communities, and it's just so great every month that we get to gather together and learn um, together about things that we need to know more about. So on your screen right now, if you're interested in the CME, we do have the title of our topic today, and we also have how to text, what number to text for your Cloud CME. So if you have that set up with Corwa, I will drop into the chat. As soon as I stop sharing my slides, I'll drop into the chat that whole process. If you don't have an account set up on Corwell's west side. It does not matter where you come from, and it doesn't matter if you're a nurse or a doctor, you still can get a certificate that says you attended this cultural training. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Laura. Great. Sorry about that. I was struggling with my mute button. All right, you can change the slide if you already went over the CMEs. So welcome to the August 2025 session for Hope Cultural Training. Next slide. This is just our acknowledgement and disclaimer. This training series is funded through Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, the Corey Engagement Award, and we just have to express that the views, statements, opinions presented in this cultural training series are solely the responsibility of the authors and the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, its board, governors, or methodology committee. And then as part of our accountability to our funder, PCORI, we are evaluating participant understanding about our monthly topics. There are two quick questions that we ask that you participate in at the start and at the end of this presentation, and we would really appreciate you guys participating and filling those out for us. And we'll remind you at the end of the presentation also. So today I'll be introducing Frank Edwigijic, and the topic today is understanding tribal sovereignty and tribal healthcare systems. I'm going to read a blurb on Frank because he has many accomplishments that I want to share with everybody. So Frank Edwigijic served in tribal elected office for 16 years, 14 as the tribal chairman of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, which is located in Harbor Springs, Michigan. During his tenure as tribal chairman, he was instrumental in the adoption of the Tribal and First Nations Great Lakes Water Accord in 2004 and the United League of Indigenous Nations Treaty in 2007. Now serving as the executive director of the United Tribes of Michigan, he is also serving on the Great Lakes Advisory Board for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and has served at several capacities with the International Joint Commission as a member of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board and as a member of the Indigenous Circle of Experts. Frank is the co-chair of the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, Federal Recognition Task Force. In addition, he is the president of the Association on American Indian Affairs and was recently reappointed by Governor Whitmer to the Michigan Water Use Advisory Council. Frank represented the National Congress of American Indians at several meetings of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change since 2015 and participated in negotiations protecting Indigenous rights at the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. Frank lives in Harbor Springs, Michigan with his wife, Rochelle. He has 4 adult children and 8 grandchildren. He is a traditional storyteller and potter
believing that Native people need to be rooted in their traditions to be prepared for the future. Frank is also was a very good friend of my mother's, and she attributes him to being her mentor on all things related to tribal leadership.
Mm.
So is he on here now?
Thank you for that introduction, Laura. While you're looking to see if there are any IT issues for our speaker, if you are able, will you please turn your camera on, because our speaker is not going to use slides and he would like to see people's faces. I know some of you are eating lunch, so you don't have to turn your your camera on if you're eating. But if you're able and willing and you don't mind, please put your camera on, and then we can have more of a conversation with our speaker. And Laura is also going to guide our conversation. So thank you for doing that, Laura.
Yes, 1 second. We're having a little bit of technical issues.
Okay. Also, if you have any questions, type them into the chat. And while we're waiting for our speaker, how about you also type into the chat, your favorite place in nature that you've visited this summer. I was recently at a seminar where they talked about climate change and things that we can do. And one of the gifts of knowledge that I felt like I took away from there was from a tribal member who said, water is such a great source of life. And if we can just convert our thinking to thinking of it as a resource and thinking of it more as a source, which goes along with the Native American traditions and their beliefs, rather. And I thought that was really cool to kind of think about our trees and our nature and our water as a source, not it's also a resource, but to think of that in that way. So anyway, drop into the chat. Love to see where you've been or where you want to go, and one of your favorite places. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to drop the CME stuff in the chat as well. If anybody else wants to ad lib, feel free.
I'll jump in here while we're navigating some technical issues. I really appreciated what you shared, Cynthia, and felt that it must have been calling to me on Sunday. My name's Catherine Williams, by the way, for those on the call. I don't know. Sorry, I just kind of jumped in there. But I spent the afternoon at Olive Shores Beach out on the lakeshore and went in Lake Michigan for the first time this summer. I'm really ashamed to say that, but definitely felt the healing properties of water on that day. So. And I also just want to share I'm loving some of the places being mentioned in the chat, because it's reminding me I have to go to all of those places before the summer ends and before what we know will happen in Michigan comes with colder temperatures, snow, and ice.
I completely agree. If I could jump in too, I just find, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a Pisces and born in March, but the water I just feel like is so healing and just beautiful. And it really does make me nervous. We need to protect these areas, our resources, our natural resources. And it's scary. It's just scary to think that those protections may be taken away even more. But yeah, Pictured Rock was it felt like sacred land. And when you get out in nature, you just really connect again with the earth. And I hadn't been there yet my whole life either. I had been past St. Ignace, so I was really embarrassed that I hadn't been there sooner and disappointed. I'm like, okay, I'm coming back as soon as I can. Munising is amazing.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. I think we are all set, so appreciate big heart out to you guys who are filling in the gaps, during our technical difficulties. So I'm going to turn it over once again to our great leader, Laura Fisher. Thanks, Laura.
Hi, everybody, and I'm glad you're on here, Frank. I read your bio for everybody. And as we were doing our little technical difficulties over here, so I apologize to everybody, but being on the road and being busy has been interesting. So Frank, it is take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, let me see if I get the screen shared. Don't see the share screen icons. I have the ability to share my screen yet.
You should
There it is. It's just,
try now.
yeah. And I will, there we go. So can you see my screen yet?
Not yet. I see some cool pottery in the background.
Yeah. 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 So let's see what there. Now you should be able to see it.
Yes, it's coming in.
Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Now I will make sure that it will go back to full screen.
If you hit that little slide icon at the bottom, it should get the full screen. Right there.
Here,
Across to your right. A little bit more right there. Yep.
this one right here.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
There we go.
Perfect. Thanks, Frank.
My apologies for being late. We had I'm at Gun Lake. I'm at the Casino Hotel, and I'm doing a presentation. I hear that hopefully you don't hear the background music that I hear. I've got a headset on that should take care of things. And you've heard my bio, and we just took a tour of the water systems here, the wells and the water treatment and the sewage treatment plants for the Water Use Advisory Council here at Gun Lake. So I want to go on with I've been talking about tribal governance for quite a while here, but I always like to start out where I'm on the Great Lakes, on the water. I think about sovereignty. I think about the interconnection we have with the land and the water and how we all are together. I also like to have people take a look at this and think of things looking at a different perspective. People don't realize this is Michigan upside down, but it gives you a whole different perspective on the water as transportation and as what people have, the native people have had to think about how we think about things in terms of what we don't look at political boundaries so much as we look at the geography as setting things up for us. Within the state of Michigan, there's a number of tribal treaties, and these treaties all set up the largest one is Big Blue Area, is the Treaty of Washington. There's 5 tribes that are part of that. But then there's other treaties that essentially cover all of the state of Michigan. And each of these treaty areas is set up to do everything's just a little bit different in each one, because each treaty is just a little bit different. Michigan's federally recognized tribes, for those who don't know, this is a list of all of the federally recognized tribes in the state. There are some non-federally recognized tribes. And if you can hang on just for a moment, there's a trying to explain where some people out in front of me where they need to go. Because we're having a meeting in the next room. Anyway, this is each of these tribes has its own governance system. And the governance systems are set up with all of Michigan's tribes have written constitutions, but tribes throughout the country may not always have a written constitution. Some have a traditional constitution that is basically by memory, what they do it by practice in their courts. But I have put this picture on here because the U.S. government, the federal constitution, governs all the relationships between tribes and the federal government. But each tribe also has its own, and I had our tribal constitution printed up at the same size because people needed to understand that tribal sovereignty is expressed through the people, are expressed through this written document that delegates power to the tribal government. In the U.S. Constitution, there are situations set up where Article 1, Section 8, the third clause, is the Commerce Clause, and this one is the acknowledgement of the U.S. Of the pre-existent sovereignty of tribal governments to the United States. We existed prior to, and so the U.S. Constitution acknowledges that. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution says that this Constitution and the laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof, that all treaties made or which shall be made are the supreme law of the land. So tribal treaties are not some dusty old document from the 1800s. Rather, they are fundamental in the relationship between the tribes. And because of this, tribes have a relationship to the federal government and only somewhat to the state government through delegation. But the primary relationship is with the federal government, which is why tribes deal largely with federal programs and federal regulation. Part of that issue for tribes and understanding tribal sovereignty, and I guess I should just sort of take a step aside here. Sovereignty is the right to be as dumb as you want to be. It's also a responsibility to be as wise as you can be. But it's tribes, just because something's stupid doesn't necessarily mean that a government isn't going to try to do it. And all governments take actions that may not be in their best interest sometimes. And this is also true of tribes, but that ability to function and to be responsible for yourself and the necessity to be as wise as you can be to protect your people and your future generations is critical. But this Marshall Trilogy established John Marshall in the 1830s, Chief Justice of the United States, and 3 opinions that set up a doctrine of dependent domestic sovereigns. The United States didn't know what to do with the fact that they had sovereign nations, Indian nations, that were recognized in the Constitution, or somehow within the borders of the United States. And so this idea about a dependent domestic sovereign is created by the Supreme Court, and that defines that relationship between tribal governments and the federal government. The whole question about wanting to be responsible for yourself, tribes, for instance, under our constitutions we have tribal courts, we have an executive branch, and actually executive, legislative, and judicial functions of tribal government are all expressed differently from tribe to tribe. In my tribe at Little Traverse, for instance, we have an executive branch that's the chair and the vice chair, and then all the administrative part of the government was behind that. Then we have a legislative branch that is 9-member tribal council that passes the laws and appropriates the money and budgets. And then we have a judicial branch, and the judicial branch consists of a lower court and an appellate court. Our appellate court is the Supreme Court of the tribe. I serve as one of the justices in the Supreme Court. And cases that arise in the tribal jurisdiction, the final resting spot of those cases where if appealed goes to the appellate court. So effectively the Supreme Court for the tribe. Within this system, we regulate and provide for funding for all of our programs and all of the different things. But I wanted to explain this general relationship to the federal government and that relationship to how we establish this legally for regulations and for establishing our own tribal laws. We also think about, and for tribes, we think about relationships, not ownership. So, for instance, our ancestors, when we signed the treaty, they didn't know the water. They found the water to come here and say, all those fish, those are our fish. We didn't say that. Instead, we reserved the right to fish. And as we reserve the right to fish, what did that mean for us? There's a Supreme Court doctrine that treaties are to be interpreted the way the Indians would have interpreted them at the time we signed them, not the way attorneys might parse the meaning today. And so when we reserved the right to fish, what that meant was we reserved the right to pray for the fish, to catch the fish, to dance for the fish, and to eat the fish. But we had a relationship with fish. Fish was a relative that helped feed us, but we also helped take care of it with mutual respect. And so it was actually a relative. It wasn't something that we owned. And so not only is that true for fish, but it's true for the air we breathe, the night sky, all the different plants, the medicine plants and the trees, for instance. All of those have their own rights and their family members as far as we're concerned. And so those are some important part of understanding how our systems work is that fundamental. We think of the world in relationship terms, not ownership. There's a quote here that I wanted to have you be able to look at. I have very few actual text slides, but this one I want to read. It's from Gregory Kahati, who runs it's the head of the Native Education Department at the University of New Mexico. He's a Pueblo Indian, and he writes, Western and Native science traditions are very different in terms of the ways in which people come to know, the ways in which knowledge or understanding is shared, how knowledge is transferred from one generation to another, and how knowledge is handled legally, economically, and spiritually. Traditional indigenous law is geared towards restitution and restoration. If traditional laws, and especially those that deal with relationships to nature, are transgressed, then restoration and restitution must occur. If the latter are ignored or mishandled, people suffer the consequences. In other words, what we're talking about here is trying to restore harmony in the world. And disease is a form of disharmony. And so this is how this relates to our traditional value systems. Tribal health systems, as I've mentioned, it's not just a concern for human population, but rather it concerns all human and non-human populations. You know, the fish that we eat, the medicine plants that we have heal ourselves with, the food plants that help feed us, and the air. So I talk about trees, plants, animals, water, soil, and air. All of these things are part of our overall view of our health systems. And the environment, it's not just where we go on weekends and vacations, rather it's where we live every day. And so we have to think of that as when we think about tribal health, we're thinking about all of those. Now, in our traditional value systems, we have teachings, the four direction teachings, which sometimes are expressed in the four different colors, yellow, red, and black, and white. or in some cases, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, starting the east, in water, wind, earth, and fire, and also the circle of life, infancy, youth, middle age, and old age. We can spend an entire day in the lodge talking about the teachings from just one of these directions and what it means to us in the practice. But we think about how we achieve balance. And one of the things we talk about is needing to stand in the middle of the world. What that means is that keeping all of these teachings in balance with each other, not doing too much in one direction or the other, because if you put all your focus one direction, it pulls you out of balance in other directions. And so this is all something that is part of our traditional teachings. We also have what are called 7 grandfather teachings, or grandmother teachings, as it may be. Love, humility, respect, truth, wisdom, honesty, bravery. And once again, each of these has so many subtle points to it. But the one I like to focus on in this, especially this, is respect. When we treat the world or those other beings in it with lack of respect, then we're out of balance. That sometimes that can create, for instance, it can create disease, it can create other issues that come about. And so the idea is that we want to try to, the opposite of respect is sort of a vacuum, it's a lack of respect. And that's true for each of these different teachings, but when we try to think of our tribal health systems, we think about them as being holistic, not just being new. So I talk about, for instance, licensed practitioners. We have MDs and physicians assistants, nurses, and dentists, and our pharmacy technicians, for instance, are all certified. So we have these, but we also have traditional medicine within our clinics. So we integrate the traditional medicine with licensed practitioners. And in doing so, we're trying to help create harmony in the community for all those people who wish to follow whichever one of those paths that they choose, or both that they may. And this is all, as I say, seeking a balance in a changing world. I know that, we have, there's it's difficult to work on finding that balance, because sometimes things get in the way. Like we just got off the tour here where we're looking at the water system, which is part of the health system. And we're at Conley Casino today. And the water system is state-of-the-art science, all the treatment, the wells, the water tower, and then the wastewater treatment, all of that has to meet standards. So tribes have to meet the same health standards everybody else does, but we do it under our own authority. So we pass laws that create similar regulatory schemes that are what the state and the federal government have, for instance. But we do this under our own auspices as we do these things. But we have to find a way to balance those things with what our traditional values are. So we have a slightly different approach to the way we do these things. So what are the systems that tribal health? What does that consist of? Many of you may know of these things, but we have direct service for tribal citizens that live in our service area. And that service area is defined as those who live on or near a reservation. Each of the 12 tribes has a different service area. They're defined differently. Some are very small, some are very expansive. Some service areas overlap with each other. So a citizen might live in 2 or 3 different service areas for tribes. And they usually get their services from their own tribe. But tribal citizens are able to go to different clinics from other tribes that are funded partially through the Indian Health Service, for instance. We also have at-large citizens. So, for instance, our citizens for my tribe who live in Lansing they're not on or near a reservation, but they still are tribal citizens. So they're eligible for certain benefits that the tribe provides. And if they travel to the reservation, they can get direct services there. But they are not eligible for some of their services that come to the federal government. There's also urban populations in the state. So, for instance, Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Lansing, in Flint, Saginaw, Detroit. Those populations that come there. The federal government had a relocation plan. They had a great idea. We were on reservations, so they were going to move us to the cities where there were jobs. So they moved a whole lot of Indians in a relocation program to cities all across the country. And what they did is they moved them to the reservation where they were not getting good services and everything, moved them into the city, and then just sort of left them there. And so now we have these large urban populations that are in Detroit, for instance. The last time I knew it, I think there were 80 different tribes represented by the natives that lived in Detroit. And some of those, many of them were from First Nations, which is what the tribes are called in Canada. So they were Canadian tribes, but they lived in the states of them for 2 or 3 generations. But they weren't members of any tribe from the U.S. So you have this large urban population that has needs, healthcare needs. And so some of the tribes have clinics. There are some organizations that provide health services in the urban areas. The Indian Health Service of the federal government provides some funding for urban health centers, but they generally are having they struggle to be funded. Tribes have dental care, medical, and pharmacy. Everyone has medical care. Most of them have dental care, and then quite a few now have pharmacies that are all run at the tribe. What services are not provided direct service at tribal health clinics are available for tribal citizens who are on the reservation, at least, through a thing called purchased and referred care. It's a special line item where we can contract with, say, a contract with an ophthalmologist or a retinologist to send our tribal citizens to specialties to get services. So we have contracts. Each tribe has outside providers that are paid for through purchased and referred care. In addition to all this, we have programs for community health, nutrition programs, mental health programs. We have part of the nutrition programs. We programs with farms to grow food, to grow healthy food for us that we can distribute through our food systems for our elders and those people who don't otherwise have good food services. So these are all things that are part of the overall tribal health system. We have it's difficult, like in any system. Most of the tribes are rural, and so we have all the problems that a rural health system has at trying to attract physicians and nurses. It's sometimes hard to find a place to live, and also we can't pay really big dollars off it. So that means that we're constantly trying to figure out how do we get this thing, keep ourselves funded. And I'm going to talk about funding next, which is a big part of the thing. Watching the clock here, because I want to leave time for questions at the end here too. So this for funding, the first thing is that we sign treaties. I mentioned the treaty reserve rights for fishing, and there's also in the treaties the government has agreed to provide for healthcare, education, and they provide money for general governance. The tribes contract to run a lot of those programs themselves. So we have a natural resource department with fisheries biologists and water quality with folks doing water. We also have this example by where we are today at this meeting. We have water treatment plants and water supply systems. Sometimes we contract with local people for that. Sometimes we do it ourselves. But that funding, the money that comes through the Indian Health Service and the money that comes from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to us that are based on the treaties the rights that were reserved in the treaties. That money is not need-based welfare. That money is rather its payment or prepaid. We signed treaties that turned over trillions of dollars in assets in minerals and land to the federal government. And in exchange, there were certain things in those treaties. It's a business deal. So that money that's provided to us is provided based on that treaty. It's not based on whether we need the money. So I tell people, if every Indian was a millionaire, the federal government would still need to make me famous. And if we're all poor, they still need to make it. So it's not based on our need, it's rather based on the treaties. But that funding that comes through Indian Health Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs was only about 30% of what's needed to run a modern health system and or tribal government. So we make that up. The funding that comes is from grants and contracts, grants from some federal agencies, and grants from foundations, contracts. We have contracts, for instance, for Medicaid and Medicare. We also we get contracts from a variety of different foundations to enhance or improve our delivery systems. The other place that we get from is from tribal enterprises. Now, I think of enterprises, we run convenience stores. Some tribes actually have land that they lease for, to do a Walmart or Myers or things like that. They lease to big box. So they make money off land leases. They make money through various other types of things. And of course, the one that everybody's aware of is to make money from casinos. And the casino revenue, I heard people say that they talk about Indian gaming, they say, well, it's really not fair because the Indians don't have to pay tax on that. They don't pay any tax. Well, that's actually a misnomer because the gaming operations run by the tribes, when after the gaming operation covers all of its costs, its employees, its capital improvement money, all the stuff that are needed to run, the casinos are taxed 100% of the profit goes to the tribal government. And that money pays for health care. It pays for child welfare systems, for instance. For dealing with child welfare. It pays for our tribal courts and judicial systems. It pays for things that we can't get funded any other way but are necessary. So that most casinos just barely cover the amount that are necessary to the government. A few small tribes make a lot more money than they need for the government. In this case, it's sometimes invested for the future in case gaming ever stops being able to be used as funding. But the casino revenue is a big part of the tribal operations, but it's not the sole, which is why I'm first about the other economic development. Some tribes own multiple-story buildings in urban centers where they lease out space and they have construction companies and design firms, engineering firms, and have diversified quite widely in terms of the revenue stream for the tribe. And then the last one I want to mention here is third-party funding. For a lot of years, we weren't able to do that, but now we have everything set up so that we can take, for instance, we have a clinic that will take any Medicaid patient, and two of the tribes at least have Medicaid clinics that will take any Medicaid patient, not just tribal citizens. We also have insurance, for instance, we're paying insurance for our employees. We let our employees use that insurance, the non-native insurance. We let them use that at our tribal clinics. So we end up, it becomes a revenue stream for us to help cover the rest of the cost. Same thing for pharmacy. So third-party funding becomes a really important part of the overall funding for our health system. Of course, every one of these revenue streams that I talked about has lots of strings of the technical side and requires a pretty intense accounting department to keep track of everything so that we can keep all the funding appropriate. And then, of course, we have to do audits. We're subject to federal audits. So we have the A133 the big audit system. So we have to, we're all the time working to try to make sure that everything's running above board, and then of course tribal governments, we all have to respond to a tribal public who is like any public, always looking to see that, thinking somebody might be doing something wrong. So the audits and everything are to keep everything above board and make sure that if anything is wrong, we'll catch it ahead. But funding is a big part of our whole operation. I want to talk about, and this is something that is really, really a part of me thinking is that we're taught to consider the results of our actions, the consequences. For a period, not long enough to consider 7 generations. So within the 7 generations, it isn't just count them out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And think of it that way. 7 generation thinking is thinking. It's like your headlights on your car shining down the road at night. And as you're driving down that road, for every 100 yards you go down the road, your headlights are 100 yards ahead of you further still. And so you never get there. But the point is that it's a time period of comfort if you think for the future, And so when I gave testimony on funding to the Senate Committee on Environment, Public Works, Senator Obama and Senator Clinton were there when I gave that testimony to help get funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative many years ago. And when I got done giving the thing, there were other people there, the scientists, that were giving all kinds of technical data and everything, why this should be funded. And I got up and I left the technical stuff for the other folks. And my testimony was focused around the philosophy of what I'm talking about here, and that idea of planning ahead 7 generations. And I had someone write me a note saying, long-term planning for me is 5 years. You look at 7 generations, that gives a whole different perspective to what you're going to think about. And when you plan for long-term trying to recover health, for instance, community health, from all the problems we've had at boarding schools, for instance, both physically and socially, all the issues that arise from it. We have to plan ahead to get out of it. We often tell people that it didn't take a generation to get us into the problems we have. We're not going to get out of it in 1 generation either. It's going to take several generations until we recover from a lot of the trauma that's been held by our people from boarding schools and from other places. So when we think about that 7 generations, think about that long time frame, but we're also looking at the idea that we're looking ahead, but each one of us here, everybody on this call, everybody who ever listened to this recording or any of this, each person is somebody's 7th generation. What were our ancestors doing 7 generations ago that caused us to be here today? What is it that they moved certain places, the geography, they've come across an ocean to be here. They may have moved voluntarily or involuntarily. But they're here. And they came, and we're the product of those things that they did, the choices that they made, and the choices in lifestyle, the choices in foods, the choices in geography, but also, the choices in philosophy of life that they made, that help guide us all to be who we are today. So from those 7 generations back to us today, we think about 7 generations from now. What are we doing now to help affect those 7 generations yet to come? How will we be renewed? And I think that one of our primary goals in life would be to be considered a good ancestor. I don't think there's any higher goal that any of us would have to do that. So that's why I think about this overall philosophy, how that all comes together. So I'm ready to take any questions if we have some. Sure. And so I guess I'll leave this to Laura. Can you take care of that? I can't see anybody, so if anybody has questions, but for me and I'll answer.
Yep, sounds good. If anybody has any questions, you can enter them into the chat, or you can even use your hand raising feature, and I can make sure that I'm calling on anybody. And then the poll just went up for the post-session evaluation. If you could make sure that you guys filled that out, we would really appreciate it.
There aren't any questions here. I either didn't tell enough or I told so much that I answered all the questions. One of the other.
I have a question, but I can't figure out how to raise my hand in this app. Because I'm new to the team. Is it okay if I talk?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Frank, for being here. This was so interesting, and it's so important to understand and recognize all of this so that we can be good advocates and, counter misconceptions with truth. So just the way I'm understanding it is, so when you're a sovereign nation and you have, the tribe has their own, what was it, like constitution and treaty that you made with the United States. I guess I'm just wondering, how does that work? Are they allowed with the people who live within those boundaries of the tribe? Are you guys beholden to both the federal government laws and your own laws within the tribe, or only some of the laws that are federal laws? Does that make sense? I don't know. It feels like a stupid question.
Yes, 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 and yes.
Okay.
To ask all the right questions. It's complicated. Jurisdiction in Indian country is very complicated because, going way back, there was an Indian who killed an army officer, and they wanted to prosecute him for murder.
Mm-hmm.
And then they realized that they technically were at war with the tribe. And if they prosecuted this guy for murder, they'd have to prosecute all the soldiers for murder too.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of rigmarole created around this. So they realized they couldn't do that. There's this out of that great discussion about what should be, how jurisdiction should be done. So there's a Major Crimes Act that if somebody is murder and rape and assault, these major crimes are federal offenses and are not dealt with in the tribal courts directly. They're dealt with in federal court. So if there's a murder on a reservation, it's the FBI investigation that will be done, and the case will be tried through the U.S. attorney in the U.S. court. However, there's co-jurisdiction in some of those cases. So some tribal courts, if there's a declination to prosecute at that level, because the crime doesn't rise to the level that the U.S. attorney must take it, but it's still a crime as far as the tribe's concerned, the tribe can then subsequently have a prosecution, and we've done that at our tribe and gotten a conviction on a case that was declined at the U.S. level. So we have this combination of things that are working together. Our tribal police, for instance, are cross-deputized often. In our case, with Traverse, the county, our police officers have federal training and also have to have the state training. So our officers already have that training. The county officers only had state training. And so the sheriff, when I asked him about cross-deputization, he said, I don't know if I can deputize your officers. I said, well, you got the right question, but we got shoe on the wrong foot. I can't deputize you until you get federal training, your officers. So they all have the same general training. We're now cross-deputized and can help each other when we need it. But we have that same kind of thing with, say, regulations and all kinds of things. And also, there's a few laws at the national level that pertain to tribes that give us jurisdiction over non-Indians. For instance, in domestic violence, we can pass the tribe those domestic violence laws that we can prosecute non-Indians. But generally, we can't prosecute non-Indians.
Okay.
Jurisdiction over Indians.
Right.
Where if a non-Indian commits a crime, we could detain him, take him to the boundary of the reservation, kick him out, execute him. So, for instance, a serial abuser might abuse a woman on one reservation, get kicked off, and go to the next reservation with no convictions, and do it again. And so we had to pass a law that allowed us to prosecute those people. So we get that from the federal government. Jurisdiction on all kinds of things back and forth. It's a really complex. There's an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that's a grid.
Yes.
And this, and you find who has jurisdiction over which thing at what time.
Right.
If you read novels, there's a really good book on this called The Roundhouse by Louise Airbridge that talks a lot about jurisdiction issues, for instance. It's a fictionalized story, but it deals with these kind of issues. And so, generally, tribal police, if they come on an accident, they can hold the scene for the sheriff or the state. We can work together on that. But there's lots of different jurisdictional issues. I could talk all day on it, but I think I've got the general gist of your question. So
yeah, I guess it's much like we have state laws and we have federal laws, and when do the federal laws take precedence over our state laws? And then within that we have our tribal sovereign communities like you guys. So yeah, I think I can understand where it gets a little complicated, but also like why it's important to make sure that everyone's communicating together and that your rights and responsibilities are honored.
One of the trainings that I do, and I do this for the trooper recruit schools for the state police. For about 5 years now, we've provided this training for every single school, every single group that went through. And I do the first hour on tribal constitutions and governance, sort of some of what I talked about here, and a little more. And then with the second hour is current and former tribal citizens who have been officers, and they are what's like boots on the ground. So we do training for the police officers, and we do trainings like this for conservation officers and things like that to help them understand the complexity of jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Yes, make much, Frank. We've got one more question in the chat and then just some comments. So Charles Shepard asks, what are some of the biggest challenges of those you feel living in urban settings?
The biggest issue is that the folks living in urban centers are usually a long ways away from their tribes. Some of them are enrolled citizens living away, and many of them are not enrolled and living there. And so they're Indians, but they're Indians without being part of the tribe, and so part of a tribe. So urban centers have cultural centers, they have health clinics, they have all this, but they have a hard time raising money, they have a hard time having an identity. They also have a pan-Indian identity often because there'll be 10 tribes. Some of those tribal citizens, those tribes have been at war with each other for 50 years. And yet their citizens are all living there together in an urban environment. And so they're all working together on providing the cultural events and powwows and things. So there's some real challenge for the urban centers. And also just defining who's a member of that whatever group they have. So sometimes you'll have competing groups of tribal citizens in an urban environment. They'll have 2 or 3 organizations that have different groups. But that raising money, particularly for healthcare, is a real challenge for the urban environments.
Yes, very much. Then I've just got comments. So this was very informative and helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much for this informational session and how you are working through challenges between federal government and sovereign nations. Thanks for the presentation. I feel enlightened. They didn't teach this to us when I was in school or college. So
we've been working hard to try to fix that lack of education because people, we worked on people, for instance, for a 4th grade textbook that Indians usually had the first paragraph of the book, of the geography book. Eventually we got to where we had the first chapter. And it's now one where we actually don't disappear throughout the whole book. When they talk about governments, they talk about county governments and state government, federal government, and they talk about tribal governments. Because they don't, often people don't think, just like I had to have our constitution printed to prove to people we were a constitutional government. People don't think of tribes as having governments. And for instance, being a lobbyable entity, tribes doing something you don't like, you can lobby the government of that tribe to do something different. But often our opponents, instead of lobbying us, have just hired attorneys and sue us. They sue us over whether we existed, rather than trying to guide us in the way that they would like. So I say this is a big challenge for us.
Maybe this has been asked before in other ones, because unfortunately I haven't been able to come to all the series and I plan to go back and watch. But do you have, are there other courses that you would recommend at certain colleges or places to learn more and get, have a better history that's true to the history of, the tribal sovereignty and how that all, works? I don't know if I answered that right.
There's a number of books, one of which is a very old book. It's from the 60s, and it's Custer Died for Your Sins by a guy named Vine Delory. Vine was a very prolific writer, wrote a whole bunch of different books about Indian relationship. One of the more intense books he wrote was The Metaphysics of Modern Existence, which uses 5-letter words to modify 5-syllable words. I mean, it's a pretty intense book, but it talks about the difference in philosophy between Western philosophy and Eastern. And that's the same thing that quote from Gregory Kahady was. So those things where I talked about that balance of that understanding the culture was a different underlying motivation. But some of the books you can learn that. There's a place called the Native Nations Institute, NNI, at the University of Arizona that has all kinds of online trainings. For instance, you could get a training that you could show during lunch hour for 5 weeks or something for them that talks about tribal governments. A lot of different leaders. One of them was me, by the way.
Okay.
And but there's other places that have things like this. What I avoid doing is going to Las Vegas, spending $2,000 on a seminar, because it'll be pan-Indian and won't be really specific. We should really do something that's more specific to your own area. And by the way, there are training companies that they just love to have things in Vegas because they think everybody wants to go gamble. So they'll put on a conference out there to give you an excuse to get money out of your system to go out there and do it. I always told people that's not, I don't advise that. But those are just a few things that you could look at. There's a little book called The History of the Ottawa and Chippewa Indians in Michigan. History of the Ottawa and Chippewa Indians in Michigan by Andrew J. Blackburn. Published in 1881 by the University, what became Eastern Michigan University was the Ypsilanti Normal School at the time. And he was one of my relatives. He's from Harbor Springs. He was the first postmaster there. And Andrew writes about our history covering about a 300-year period. And so you can learn a lot from that. There are other books. A guy named Jim McClurkin, he's written several books. He lives in Lansing. One of the books was The Way It Happened. The Way It Happened. And that's the history of Little Traverse. But there's also a book about the history of Grand Traverse. George Weeks wrote that. He's former press secretary for Governor Milligan. And then there's another book on Little River. So virtually every tribe has a book about its history that's approved by the tribe itself. So those are good books to look at.
I also have a question and don't know how to use the raise your hand function. So, Frank, thank you so much for your time and sharing all of the information and resources that you have today. I couldn't keep up with you on some of these resources shared, but I would love to maybe exchange some emails with you and make sure that the links that I'm finding are correct. So if it's okay, I'd love to follow up with you so we can be sure that all these good recommendations are in our growing garden on the Intertribal Council of Michigan website.
Oh, very good. I can do that. So,
Awesome. Thank you.
Also there, I would like to echo the gratitude that and the knowledge that you shared with us. There is a question in the chat where someone asked, are there traditional indigenous medicine courses for non-indigenous medical students? And I would just like to comment that I do know Dr. Anamikwam here in Michigan is trying to set up some educational things for medical students that are non-indigenous or indigenous. So I can connect you to him, the person who asked that question, but I'd like to also ask that question to our speaker.
Well, medicine is restoring balance, restoring harmony. And so, chemical medicines from pharmaceutical corporations are one way of doing that. Other ways of doing that are through the plants. But traditional medicine is not something you can just study and have it come out as, you can't just get a list of things and say, this does this, this does that. There's a book called Native American Herbology. It's 70 years old, but it lists what we may use of some particular plant, but it also lists Russian and it lists India, from India. And the same plant will be used for different things, 3 different plants. That's the same thing. Because what it is that the medicine, it works because you ask it to work. And you can't teach that necessarily. And you have to experience, you have to understand. So traditional medicine is it's a philosophy as much as it is a study of facts. I work a lot with the World Intellectual Properties Organization in Geneva on treaties to help protect traditional knowledge. And we're working with patent attorneys from all over the world that are trying to work on these treaties, patents, trademarks, and copyrights. And we're trying to protect indigenous knowledge systems from these property rights systems. We don't, as you heard me earlier mention, we don't think of these. The medicine plants are not our property. They're our relatives. And our relatives, if they're asked in a certain way, will do so one thing. If they're asked in another way, they'll do another thing. So that's not something that you could just take a class in and say, here's a list of things, this is what they do. There's certain basic things you can do that, but the healing, I know one healing was not rest, but a young lady was going to lose her leg. This is 100 years ago. And it's a story of my family. When she was going to lose her leg because she was out, the doctors couldn't hear it. And her mother, who had given up the traditional ways, that was a gas that her daughter was going to lose her leg. She went to the medicine man. The medicine man, in a prayer, a song, created a box, like a top coffin, and a box of wood, and smudged her so the smudge would lay around her while she was in that. And then sang a couple of songs, and then told him to make a dress for her out of the white fabric with little flowers on it. And she had to take a wash it, but she had to wear that dress every day till it wore out. And this woman died in all moment with both her legs. But which thing in that was the thing that caused the healing? Or was it all a placebo effect that caused it to heal? Well, placebo effects are real if they work. So what do you do? So in other words, to understand traditional medicines, you have to understand this. The other thing to remember, and I know I'm a little over time on here, but I was trying to get done and everything, so I don't want to hold everybody up. I kind of schedule, but we have every one of us is indigenous to the earth. Everybody's an indigenous person. We all have roots in medicines on the earth. Shiki, strength from the earth. That's what we call medicine, strength from the earth. All of us have that in our roots. All of us. And all of modern medicine actually comes from strength from the earth for these different things. And so we all have that tie and something that belongs to everybody. Some of us are a little further away from those indigeneity than others, but everybody's indigenous to the earth, and we all share that. We live on one earth under one sky, with one water, one sun, you know, and so, you know, to think of it that way is really important. Because, you know, that picture of the blue planet, that famous picture of the Earth, that's where we live. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, Miigwech, Frank, I wanted to just add something on that traditional medicine question, just because that's the area that I worked in for many years. You can always find online things like Frank said that potentially you can learn something from, but it's not necessarily what is of the area. In traditional medicine, I've worked over 20 years with traditional healers, and there's never a day that I feel like I would have even this much knowledge in the conversation. And it takes a long time to stay in a relationship with these people. And there's so many aspects of it that you have to have understanding of. It's not just the plants, and it's not just the ceremony. There's combinations, and there's so many variations of that across nations. And so if you're just trying to better understand the communities in which you're serving, I do know that some of the tribal health systems have traditional medicine programs in place where you could potentially just go in as like a student to observe for a couple hours or something, or ask them questions. And that is showing them that you have an interest to better serve their tribal populations and their community members. So I just wanted to add that in, because I think it's a big conversation that is off the charts all the time. And a lot of our tribal populations worry, just like Frank said, about our knowledge being exploited or taken or used in ways in which it's not supposed to be. So I just wanted to add that into that piece of the conversation. And Frank, Miigwech, for all of your knowledge and your time and everything that you've done for our tribal communities across the nation, and for being here today. We really appreciate everything that you've done and for taking the time. And we're very appreciative.
Miigwech.